Welcome to the From Harm to Healing podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jones, and I'm a therapist who runs the From Harm to Healing treatment program, an online program for men who have engaged in infidelity or compulsive sexual behaviors within the context of an intimate relationship. I started this podcast to illuminate some of the common blind spots within the treatment fields for compulsive sexual behavior or sex addiction through the lens of the deceptive sexuality trauma model. I hope you find this resource enlightening, particularly if you're somebody navigating the pain of betrayal and deception for yourself. Thank you for listening to the From Harm to Healing podcast. I'm really continuing the theme today from conditions over techniques, attending skills, using the voice, intentional, healthy vibes, all of these things we've been speaking about. But I want to tie it together and think a little bit bigger picture now about what it is we're actually heading towards when we think of all of these different skills, all of these things that need to be developed. What is the bigger theory of healing or theory of progress, if you like, with the DST model? So beyond simply stabilizing the relationship or the partner or the individual that maintained the basement, how do we really move towards actual healing and reconstruction of a new healthy relationship or new healthy individuals moving forward? And central to this is the idea that traumatic stories, and specifically what we would talk about here, abuse victim trauma stories, need to be told. The victim of this kind of harm needs to be able to tell their story and be held, be empathically witnessed as they tell that story so that they can metabolize it and transform the meaning that is attached to that story. So as long as these stories, these painful realities are kept contained inside and fragmented and suppressed, then trauma will keep coming out. They need to be, again, held, empathically witnessed so that they can really tell their story honestly, the impacts that occurred to them, so that they can transform the meaning attached to the story. This is a fundamental way that trauma is healed. This is central to the idea of talk therapy and why it can be so impactful, so healing when we think about trauma. And to understand this a little bit more, I want to think about three particular things. We have the idea of holding or being held, the idea of co-regulation, and then the idea of ultimately getting the story out, being able to tell the story of what happened. So first of all, with holding, we need to really be conscious that holding doesn't just mean soothing. It doesn't mean telling somebody that it's all going to be okay, it's all fine. Holding really means containing the raw, unprocessed emotional states that a person is carrying so that those raw, unprocessed emotional states can be metabolized. And so when we think of what a therapist is doing, when someone comes to a session who is carrying trauma, the therapist is essentially in that moment holding the person's unprocessed, difficult emotions that are coming out so that the person can sit in that safe environment and work through them, talk through them. So this is the idea of the therapist, for example, being a safe container for the person carrying the harm. And remember, we've talked about this in previous episodes, that being safe or being a safe container is largely based on the vibes, the energy we're really giving off. We can't tell somebody that we're safe. We demonstrate it through our own regulation and the vibes we are giving off. Things like integrity, safety, humility, things like our body language, our tone of voice, the words we're using. So for someone who is acting as that container, they have to be obviously a safe person or be presenting, giving off the vibe of being a safe person. And if that person that is now tasked with holding a trauma story briefly for somebody else so it can be processed is focusing on correction or pushback or challenging the narrative, rather than just simply containing, holding that narrative. Every time that's happening, the safe container, the idea of that container is being ruptured. The person does not feel held. So imagine a scenario where you are describing your pain, describing the impact on you to somebody else, and the first thing you get is pushback on it or a correction of that narrative. In that moment, do you feel truly held by the person opposite you? Of course you don't. You feel the rupture, you feel the disconnection. Whereas every time that person who is tasked with holding the story simply sits with you, validates the story, understands the story, demonstrates empathy, stays calm, stays present, open body language, eye contact, all of these things, it is helping you, it is providing you with the conditions to get that story out, to really authentically tell the story, not focus on how the person's receiving it, not focus on every little detail, but just raw, authentic voicing of your pain, of your story. And in that scenario, the other person, the holder, if you like, is taking their story, their ego out of it. They are approaching you with humility, just sitting, focusing on you, understanding it is not about them, it is not about their narrative right now. It is about you. It is about you getting the story out. And then this second term, so we started with holding, the second term of co-regulation. So co-regulation occurs when one person's calm, regulated nervous system helps to stabilize and soothe another person's dysregulated nervous system. So this idea that human beings have a tendency to regulate to other people around them. We are communal beings. So one person's regulated nervous system helps to stabilize and soothe another person's dysregulated nervous system. So in the case of trauma recovery, going back to that picture I'm painting of a therapist and a client presenting with trauma in the room, if the therapist is grounded, regulated, present, calm, all of those things we're talking about, then the person telling their story to that therapist essentially borrows their grounded nervous system. So that person is having to bring up dysregulating material, painful material, the painful story, but they're able to go to that dysregulating information by borrowing the regulation from, again, let's say the therapist sat in front of them. They're no longer having to hold that story alone. And the therapist or the person holding them in this scenario is sending co-regulating signals, perhaps a soft, steady voice, again, open body language, simple phrases, I'm here, you're not alone, what was that like for you? How did that feel for you? What was going on for you when that happened? In that scenario, the story can gradually be told, gradually be processed, and can gradually be integrated into the ego with different meaning or different emotions attached to it. So that gives us a pretty clear understanding of how co-regulation, holding can happen in an ideal environment. Again, that's why a therapeutic environment can be a very powerful one. What we see with the environment within a relationship where there is a secret sexual basement present, or where there is deceptive sexuality trauma, is the exact opposite of that. In many ways, it's an anti-holding environment. It's a co-dysregulating environment. In the covert phase, for example, so the phase where the secret sexual basement is still hidden, perhaps she doesn't know about it yet, and so she's living in this intentionally manipulated reality, she might bring fragments of fear or suspicion. She might voice that something feels off, something doesn't feel right. And instead of him receiving that and helping her metabolize it, he might instead attack her experience. No, you're imagining things, you're overreacting, that never happened. So rather than holding or containing, he is actually pushing back. And those are some of the patterns of integrity abuse that we highlight in this model. And when that happens, rather than those fears, those feelings being metabolized, the opposite is happening. Those unprocessed feelings are then pushed back inside, often now with more negative emotions attached to them, with more confusion, more shame, more self-doubt. And then perhaps even more explicitly, when we think of the exposure phase, where the secret sexual basement has discovered, the intimate partner now so often has this reality and ego fragmentation. Their whole story has crumbled before them, the story of the relationship, what they thought was true, or their worst fears have been confirmed. They now have this intense, acute trauma story that needs to be told, that needs to be processed. Meanwhile, so often the person that had maintained the secret basement, who has caused all of this harm and this pain, has experienced their own ego fragmentation. Their compartmentalized life has crashed together, and their own ego defenses are at an all-time high. And so in those moments when the partner brings up that pain, that anger starts coming out, the trauma story starts coming out, rather than him being a co-regulating presence, someone to stay present and contain and hold that story and honor that story, he becomes the exact opposite. He offers dysregulating signals. He offers defensiveness, minimization, corrections or justifications. Maybe his body language is closed down, or there's a frustrated or defensive tone, rolling of the eyes. Maybe shutting down completely, stonewalling, looking at the floor, leaving the room. And this is leading to further rupture rather than any chance of co-regulation. Co-regulation is incredibly difficult in this scenario at the best of times, but when met with, again, defensiveness, all of these things I'm talking about, rupture is a certainty. And again, her story is continually invalidated and pushed back inside, but crucially, this time with even more negative emotions attached to it. And then what we find is the same story, the same thing keeps coming out over and over. And then for men I work with, I will often hear things like, we keep talking about the same thing. She keeps bringing the same things up. Well, this is so often what is happening. Those things are being brought up, but they are never really being processed or repackaged or having the negative emotions attached to them processed. They are actually being empowered with more negative energy and pushed deeper inside, ready to come out again, even stronger the next time. And we really need to have empathy and a deep understanding for just how lonely, how empty, how scary this position can be for the partner, especially in this exposure phase. When we think of deceptive sexuality trauma, even friends, even family often can't be that person that can hold, that can co-regulate. Normally, when we experience a painful event, those are the kind of people we can go to. But so many people misunderstand this type of trauma. And even if they have some kind of understanding, it can often be not too long before the shame of staying kicks in. Comments from friends or family, well, why are you staying? Why did you choose this relationship? Those kinds of things. We could think about the treatment field. We experience a trauma. One of the go-tos is to go to therapy. But we know that unfortunately, when we think of betrayal trauma, deceptive sexuality trauma, so often, even in treatment, even with supposedly highly trained professionals, the partner can quickly be subtly or even explicitly blamed for what's happened. The partner's trauma reactions can be pathologized. They're overreacting. They keep bringing the same things up. It takes two to tango. All of these things that we're very aware of, unfortunately, in this treatment field. In this exposure phase, particularly early on, it might only be other betrayed partners, betrayed partner support groups that are found, hopefully a good therapist that can act as this holder, as this co-regulating presence. And often there will be almost nobody else that can fulfill that role, leaving the partner in an extremely vulnerable place with this extreme story to tell of trauma, this abuse victim trauma reality to tell, but no one that can really listen to it. No one that can really help the partner feel heard, understood, empathized with. So hopefully an initial safety net is found, external from the relationship. Again, this will often be a good therapist if one can be found. But for long-term healing to happen, coming back to the starting point of this episode, for real healing to occur for the partner, for the relationship, it is pretty much imperative that the husband, the partner, the person that built the secret sexual basement, the person that caused the harm, the person that is being tasked with restorative justice, restitution in the relationship, they must become this person. They must develop the ability to sit with this story, to hold their partner as they tell this story, to stay grounded and be that co-regulating presence, and to be able to help them get that story out. And that is why we talk about this need for ego work beyond just behavioral change work. So we start with the CES, the compulsive entitled sexuality. We look at the IAD, the integrity abuse behaviors, and we look at the basic attending skills that need to be developed. All of these behavioral change parts, what we sometimes call the stage 2 work, where we're really focusing on stabilization, that is absolutely critical. It is absolutely necessary, but it is also not sufficient. If we just stop at that behavioral change work, we might achieve some stability, but I struggle to believe we can really rebuild a new relationship without that story being processed within the relationship. So the intimacy work, the intimacy with the self, the integration work, integrating, developing my ego, my story, being able to face the reality, the abuse victim trauma nature of my story, becomes critical to my own recovery longer term, beyond that behavioral change work, as someone who is engaged long term in deceptive sexuality. And an analogy I like to use to explain this is that if I am that man, if I have caused this harm, if I have caused this great trauma for my partner, every time she brings that story up, every time she is triggered, every time she is describing her pain to me, it is like she is holding a mirror up to me that is reflecting to me the harm that I've caused, the things that I am most ashamed of. Every time she is bringing that story up, she is shining the spotlight on me, holding up that mirror to my shame, to my failings, to my shortcomings. That is a very difficult mirror to look in. And I would say it is an impossible mirror to look in if we aren't able to do that ego work and really reconcile what we've done. Accept what we've done, not because it's okay, but because until I can accept the reality, the truth, that abuse victim trauma reality, then I cannot look at that. I cannot hold my partner's pain. I cannot be the co-regulating presence, because my own story is going to continue to dysregulate me until I've transformed the meaning that I have attached to that. So hopefully everything I've talked about here makes sense. And this might seem a million miles away for some people. The thought of really being able to do this work might seem so far away. But just really thinking perhaps at this stage in terms of what it would look like to get to that point, what would need to happen to get to that point. And that is where I want to push this idea again, that behavioral change is absolutely critical. It is completely necessary as a foundation. But unless you are finding ways to really get in touch with yourself, develop your authentic voice, integrate your story, do this deeper ego work, then it is going to be almost impossible to get to this place I'm talking about, where holding, co-regulating, and real healing can happen moving forward. Thank you for listening to this episode of the From Harm to Healing podcast. If you'd like to find out more information about the deceptive sexuality trauma model itself, you can visit minwalamodel.com. If you're interested in the services that I offer, in particular the From Harm to Healing treatment program, please visit chrisjonestherapy.co.uk.